Welcome, everybody. Sorry for the slight delay. Keep in mind that what we are doing here is typically a 2-hour presentation that we would do in person, and we are going to jam this into 1 hour. So because this is recorded, you will have the option to go back and pause the video and look at these different slides. Some of this I'm going to have to go over a little quicker than I normally would in person, but I am going to highlight some things as it pertains to planting smaller trees and shrubs that are used for forestry and wildlife purposes typically. And then the second part of this presentation tonight will be Emily Puchibe, who is going to talk about fruit trees. So hopefully this is going to be useful information for those of you who are going to be doing some planting this spring or even next fall. So to start out, obviously, we want to think about why do people plant trees and shrubs, and there's a whole laundry list of reasons here. These are some of the more common reasons that I encounter when I assist landowners, everything from planting from shade and beauty to possibly raising a timber product to planting for wildlife habitat, maybe controlling erosion problems, maybe converting something that is poor habitat such as invasive species dominated areas. Some people like to plant for edible and medicinal uses, which is great. Some folks just want to increase the diversity on their property. So, instead of having 1 or 2 species of trees or shrubs, maybe having 9, 10, 11, 12, more than that even. And then a reason that's really becoming common lately is planning for climate change. And I have a link here to a project called the Assisted Tree Range Expansion Project, which is a great project. And I encourage you to check out that link. So next slide, Emily. So what do trees and shrubs require? Usually I spend a little bit more time on these topics, but I'm going to just make sure I highlight the take-home messages here. Light is obviously important. What I encourage people to do is not think of trees in terms of what they require for sunlight, because most trees actually love to be in sunlight. There are some exceptions, but the way I like to think of it is which trees can grow in the shade, because some absolutely cannot. If you plant something like an aspen tree in the shade, it is almost guaranteed to die on you. That's not enough sunlight for a tree like that. That table you see at the top on the right shows varying degrees of what are called shade tolerance. So some species cannot tolerate shade at all, things like black willow, jack pine, quaking aspen. Some are very tolerant of shade, so species like eastern hemlock, sugar maple, and American beech. Soil is also very important. And by the way, I'm going to stop my video. I'm sure you've had enough of my face by now. You saw it a little bit when we first started, but I'm going to stop it so that you can focus on the slide. So matching soils to the species is also really important. And the way I like to think of this in terms of both sunlight and especially soils is when you're choosing trees and shrubs to plant, I tend to encourage people to think about where do you typically see these trees and shrubs growing, not where you can actually get them to survive technically. If you do enough tender love and care with your tree planting practices, you can get many trees and shrubs to survive under most situations. However, a wise approach, especially when you're planting hundreds or thousands of tree seedlings, is to try to match the site to where Mother Nature would show you the tree can grow. So where is it most commonly found? Something like jack pine is most commonly found in a pretty sandy soil with lots of sunlight. Jack pine can actually grow on some wet areas too, where the nutrients are really poor, believe it or not, in the boreal ecosystems. However, it's helpful to know where are trees most commonly found. And if you put something like jack pine on a richer site, it actually can do really well, but it competes best on these really nutrient poor sites where you often see it in north central lower Michigan and then up in the plains of the upper peninsula as well. Growing space is something to consider. So when you choose the proper spacing, here is where I really recommend you consult with a professional to get some recommendations on how far apart do you space the trees. It's a very common question. The answer to that is it depends on your goal. So if you're planting a windbreak, for example, you can plant conifers close for a windbreak, but the idea there is you need to thin them out at some point so that they're not crowding each other to the point where the trunks are growing too straight and branch free, because that defeats the purpose of the windbreak. So a more effective approach is to keep them at a wide spacing from the very beginning, like 15 to 20 feet apart. If you're doing something like a red pine plantation where you want them to grow for straight timber, then a 7x7 or a 7x8 spacing is common. Deciduous trees for either wildlife habitat or timber production, or both, 10x10 is very common. And shrubs, you can typically squeeze in at about a 6 to 8 feet spacing, and they'll do just fine in terms of competition. Next slide, Emily, please. Great. So the next few slides, I'm just going to highlight a few of the trees and shrubs that you might commonly see on conservation district tree sale lists, or even just general nursery lists. And the disclaimer here is that my focus is very much on native species, not exotics. So these are all natives, with one weird exception here. The Black Hills spruce is technically Picea glauca, which is the same as our Michigan white spruce, but it's from a different region. It's from the Dakota region of the US, and it's supposed to tolerate droughty soils better than our native Michigan white spruce. Other than that, these are all species you will see in Michigan. So full sunlight, typically you're going to see things like black cherry, jack pine, red pine, shrubs such as eastern red cedar, blueberry called low bush blueberry, very common on these dry fully lit sites. Trees that can tolerate some amount of shade on these dry sites, things like Black Hills, black oak, white pine, northern pin oak, shrubs such as witch hazel, hazelnut, and small trees such as serviceberry. Next slide, Emily. Now, this is what I would consider a wetland situation. So these can be swamps grading into something like a marsh. And there are quite a few things, actually, when you see these tree sale lists that can grow in these wet areas. Quite a few charismatic trees and shrubs, in fact, especially on the shrub end. So trees like eastern cottonwood, tamarack, also known as larch, willow, try to stick to native willows like black willow, ash, obviously, I know we're losing that one, red maple, shrubs such as American cranberry bush, also known as high bush cranberry. I use the term American cranberry bush because you want to make sure you're getting the native species and not the European high bush cranberry. Other shrubs, buttonbush, winterberry, red osier dogwood, these are all great choices. And you can see there's a range of shade tolerance here. So lots of choices. And I put a little asterisk next to these species that are predicted to do well under multiple climate change models. So these are ATREP species. These are part of that assisted tree range expansion project. These are species that are native to southern Michigan, but are predicted to do really well northward, especially northwest lower peninsula. And a couple examples there would be hackberry and swamp white oak and black gum. Next slide. Now this would be that intermediate site. So those rich soils, not too wet, not too dry. There's a huge list of species here. And something important to keep in mind is lots of things that grow on really dry sites will also do really well on these intermediate sites, as I call them, with the rich soils that are not too wet. However, if a tree or a shrub is really most often found in a wetland, you can't take a species like that and move it to a dry site and expect it to do very well unless you're giving it lots of TLC in terms of water and other things that it might need. So it's not a two-way directional movement where you can bring wet species up to the dry sites, but you can typically bring dry species down to the rich sites, but not too wet. So hopefully that makes sense. Jack pine's a good example. If you put jack pine in a loamy soil, it's going to love you, but it may not compete very well with some of these species you see listed here, because these are where these species typically grow. And again, more ATREP species, sassafras, shagbark hickory. Next slide. So this often comes up, bare root or containerized stock. Bare root, basically, as you see at the pictures at the bottom, these are seedlings with the roots exposed. They get pulled out of the ground, they're bare root. When you see a -0 at the end of a seedling, that means it's a 1-0, 2-0, 3-0, 1-year-old, 2-year-old, or 3-year-old that grew on a nursery bed at a very tight spacing for that number of years. transplants have been moved to another bed after the initial nursery bed and grown so that they can get a little taller and the root systems develop a little more. Transplants are bigger, obviously. They may have better survival rates. That's debatable. And they do take a little bit longer to plant because they are bigger. Containerized seedlings are the type that you see at the bottom right there, all the way to the right. These have a soil plug attached to their roots. So you get the soil with the roots. These are great. They minimize planting error in a lot of cases because people often do not mistakenly plant them, with the exception that you have to untangle those roots because those roots can get a little bit constricted around the edges of those root plugs, around the edges of that soil. So they're typically more expensive, not always, but typically. And survival tends to be better, but in my opinion, we need to do a better job of figuring out if the reason for that is actually because of a lack of planting error. But it is helpful to have the soil with the roots when you plant. And typically at conservation district tree sales, you're going to get bare root seedlings. We don't typically carry containerized. Next slide. Here's another one that people often debate about. One thing you're going to find throughout this presentation is that I'm not going to give you black and white answers because they simply don't exist. A lot of these things are hotly debated even amongst professionals. So you can make arguments both ways. And this is a great example, this spring versus autumn planting. I personally am still very much a fan of spring planting, but something that has caused me to kind of think, well, we need to be more careful about it, or at least be more careful about what we do with those trees when we're putting them in the ground and maintaining them, are these summer droughts that we're more commonly getting, partly due to the effects of climate change. So spring is often preferred by many professionals still. One reason is that you're putting them in the ground and they're allowed to basically be in their new home, their final home, if you will, for an entire growing season before they experience their first harsh Michigan winter. I think there's a lot to be said for that. If you're going to plant in spring in this part of Michigan, April to early May is the best season. The seedlings are still dormant, and they basically just came off the nursery beds. They might have gone through a conservation district before they get into your hands as a landowner. So dormant and before the true beginning of the growing season. The fall has some advantages as well. Some disadvantages are high mortalities due to frost heaving, especially in heavy soils like clay, dry winter winds. There can be higher levels of damage from rodents when they first key in on those seedlings when you put them in the ground. But an advantage, especially with summer droughts, is the precipitation that we get consistently in the fall. That can be helpful. So watering is not as big of an issue when you pop seedlings in the fall, if you're going to do that. And October is the month to plant in Northwest Lower Peninsula. Next slide, Emily. So site prep and post-planting weed control. Very critical, in my opinion, with some disclaimers. It all depends on the site. Preparing the site is definitely critical, at the very least assessing the site before you put those seedlings in the ground, and then come up with a strategy. Next slide. So for small projects, define that however you want. I used to have a quantity in here that defined small, but you learn that small is really a subjective term depending on the landowner. Some people consider small just 10 seedlings, and anything more than that is large. I consider small just a couple hundred seedlings, and large would be in the thousands of seedlings. So define small however you wish. It depends on how much labor or how much your contractor is willing to put in terms of labor. However, for site prep, a lot of times for these small quote unquote projects, to prepare the site to put the seedling in the ground, you can do something called scalping, which is removing those weeds in an approximate 36-inch diameter circle, and you pop the seedling in the middle of that circle after you've scalped it. You can use a whole number of garden tools to implement the scalping. Lots of different tools are effective for that purpose. I like to use one called, I'm not going to name the brand because we're recording this, but it has curved tines at the very end of the tool, and you stick it in the ground just a little bit, you twist it, and it rips those sod layers right off without taking off too much of the beneficial topsoil. So I think that's a great tool for what's called scalping. Once you've scalped it, you can pop that tree or shrub in the center of that now weed-free area. That center picture you're seeing there with the little conifer, that was an area that was scalped. You can see a circle there that's pretty much bare soil. Yep, perfect. Thank you. Once you've done that, some folks also like to do post-planting weed control immediately by using some kind of weed mat. So that bottom diagram you're seeing shows a seedling planted with a fabric type weed mat, but you can also use mulch for this purpose. You can use herbicide. If you're not going to lay something down, you can use coconut weed barriers, work really well, or you can just mow or hand plant. With mowing, obviously be careful not to damage the seedling when you're mowing around it. But either way, you want to keep weeds, especially grasses, down near that seedling. Some weeds are not a problem at all. Some trees can live just fine with a small collection of forbs and herbaceous plants that don't form these heavy sod layers that can really rob water and nutrients from that little tree seedling. But if you have heavy grasses, that's something to really get under control where you're planting. And of course, if you use herbicides, that label on the bottle is the law. It's a federal law. You have to follow that label, so don't go off label. Next slide. For large projects, there are lots of approaches. Something I find effective is a tilling approach for these big areas. And by big areas, really what I'm referring to here are these fallow areas that have become just completely immersed with exotic, usually invasive species that have just totally covered 100% of the growing space. And there's a serious conversion that's needed. To get at that, we could do a whole talk on how to control invasive shrubs. And in fact, we do presentations and workshops on that very topic. But once you've dealt with those, you'll still often have these heavy layers of grasses and things like spotted knapweed, which actually pumps a chemical in the soil that inhibits plants that grow around it. Often a repeated tilling combined with a herbicide application and or cover cropping can often help convert that site and get it ready for a seedling planting. So again, you don't want to till the snot out of it to the point where you're losing your beneficial topsoil, but till to bust those sod layers up. If you get more germination after that, till again. You can treat a flush of the green with a herbicide at the end of the season if need be. I've found this often isn't that necessary. Plant a cover crop such as oats that will winter kill over that winter. And then the following spring in April, you can just lightly disc that cover crop residue in, and that residue can actually act as a mulch. And you can plant your tree and shrub seedlings amongst that mulch, if you will. And of course, post-planting weed control is the same as I discussed with the previous slide. Next slide, Emily. One disclaimer here, scalping is actually a very effective method for what I would call large projects when you don't have those crazy dense grass layers that you're dealing with. And a classic example of this is maybe you're planting thousands of tree seedlings in the understory of an existing forest. You don't want to go in there and start doing aggressive tilling and things like that, because you'll actually harm a lot of the beneficial native plant communities in what we call the understory, which is the ground layer of a forest. Instead, you can gauge each seedling. In some cases, you don't have to do any weed control. You can just pop it right in the soil because everything they need is right there in the soil. In other cases, if you got some problematic patches, especially if they're exotic plants, just scalp a little 36-inch diameter area and pop the seedling in. You can easily do this with thousands of seedlings. So these underplanting projects I found are quite efficient, even at the scale of thousands of seedlings, because of the lack of a need for aggressive weed control. But it depends on what you're in your understory. If you have a forest dominated by things like autumn olive or buckthorn or something like that, that's a different scenario yet. You got to get that stuff under control first. Next slide. So handling tips, real quick. These are important things. We at the Conservation District are really mindful of these things. So when we hand seedlings off to you, and the nurseries we purchase from are also mindful of these things. When you get your bare root seedlings, they should come with packing material. We wrap our seedlings in nursery paper, and we pack them with either wet shredded paper or sphagnum moss, also wet. We keep the roots moist, but we don't oversaturate them. This is kind of a debatable issue. You'll see some literature that says soak your trees in water for so many hours, but not beyond this number. And the number of hours you'll read about can vary from, source to source in terms of who's saying it. But in my experience with these small seedlings, I do not soak them in water. I keep the roots moist and cold the entire time after they've been lifted from the nursery, and get them in the ground, because there's some beneficial properties to those soil particles that are on the roots. And I try not to wash those off. So cold and moist is good, but oversaturated is not. In terms of temperature, the ideal temperature is not freezing. So once they've come out of the ground from the nursery, you don't want to freeze them. You want to keep them cold, but that ideal range is between just above 32 degrees to the mid 40s typically. And that's where we try to keep them during packing and the whole process during our Conservation District tree sale. The one exception to this is sometimes trees are actually pulled from the nursery beds in the fall, and they're frozen through the winter, and then they're taken out of cold storage after they've been frozen all winter. However, the disclaimer there is you don't refreeze them after they've been taken out of cold storage. So seedlings sometimes are lifted in the fall by the nursery out of the ground, stored all winter, and then when they're taken out of cold storage, the same rules you see here apply. So just don't get confused by that. If you can't get them in the ground right away would typically be within 72 hours after they've come out of the ground from a nursery. There's a little bit of wiggle room there, lots of wiggle room actually, but essentially when you get them from a Conservation District tree sale, you want to get those things in the ground within a day or two if you can. If you cannot, healing in is an option, and that's just a method whereby you dig a trench, you pop the seedlings in, and you put them in the ground temporarily before you pull them out of the ground and put them in their final home. And you can refer to that resource there. There are lots of diagrams out there about healing in as well. Next slide, Emily. So now you're ready to plant. Couple methods. Most of you are, if you're planting trees on your own especially, you're going to be doing what's called hand planting. One way, if you don't have heavy soils, and by heavy I mean really heavy clay, and I'll get to that in a moment, but if you have what's a typical soil, especially in Northwest Lower Peninsula Michigan, you can use a tool called a planting bar or a planting dibble. And that diagram you see, the top part of that diagram you see, there is somebody demonstrating the dibble method, where you create the hole, you put the seedling in, and then you use that same tool, back off a couple inches, and you push the soil into that seedling, and then you seal that second hole shut. If we were to do something like this in person, I would show you the tool and do kind of a mock planting with the dibble. But that's a pretty good diagram you're seeing there at the top. If you have transplant stock, which is that stock that has a -1 or a -2, remember it's a bare root stock that has been put in a transplant bed, so it has larger roots and is taller, then a shovel or a spade is really the way to go. Mostly because a dibble will typically not create a large enough hole so that you can put in a transplant seedling. So you want to use a spade, something that you can get a big enough hole so you don't crush those roots. If you have a lot of clay, lots of different opinions here. You're going to see all kinds of different opinions. In general, you can amend the soil if you have heavy clay. I recommend you do not use a dibble, because a dibble will compress the pore space in clay and create these impenetrable walls around the planting hole, and the roots just can't get through them. So if you are going to amend, do not put a bunch of sand or gravel at the bottom of the hole and then put the inherent soil on the top, because when water starts penetrating the top, it's not going to get through that clay to the more permeable soil below. So typically you can actually elevate the seedling and change the grade. That's one method. That's pretty time consuming. Or you can just make sure you mix in a component of sand and organic matter, and don't create it in layers. or don't put it in there as layers, and just make sure you're doing something so that there's enough pore space in the hole. And by that, I don't mean big air spaces. I mean enough room for the roots to grow so that they won't be constricted by these clay walls, if you will. Next slide. This is just an example of a machine planter, something that you might run into if you hire a contractor. And this is really only feasible if the site is adequate enough for a machine planter. So you see a machine planter being pulled by a tractor there, and basically the site needs to be pretty clean from debris. It can't have stumps remaining that are spaced too close together. There have to be a lot of things in place before you can haul a machine planter on a tractor. And basically, this is a quick way to get seedlings in the ground, especially for conifers. Next slide. Here's a fun topic for many of you, as I'm sure you know, this is one of my favorite topics. And I am a bow hunter. I value having deer populations in Michigan. I value equally as much having them at correct densities so that we have forests in the future. Deer browsing is a statewide issue right now. It's more of an issue in some portions of Michigan than others, but I can tell you many seedlings at this point in this part of Michigan require protection from deer if you're going to plant. Multiple ways to do this. If you're going to plant a block of seedlings and you want to just protect that whole block, fencing is an option. I wouldn't go any shorter than 8 feet tall for fencing. A lot of people go anywhere from 8 to 10 to 12. Shorter than that for fencing, deer can easily hop over it and start munching on your seedlings. If you're going to put a protection around an individual seedling where a deer obviously can't hop inside that protective thing, then a 5 feet tall tree tube or a cage is adequate. I would not go shorter than 5. 5 is what's generally considered the browse line in Michigan. So that seedling needs to get above 5 feet and put on some girth before it won't die from getting nibbled on by deer. But if you use shorter tubes, you're running a risk. You can get away with 4-footers, I would argue, with certain shrubs. They're going to put out multiple leaders that can handle getting munched on a little and still thrive. But in general, 5 feet, maybe 4 feet for some shrubs. For some conifers, you can use bud caps, which is that middle picture you're seeing there. It's basically just a piece of paper, essentially, that's stapled to the terminal bud to protect it from being munched on by the deer. That can be somewhat common. And then there are repellents. So the thing to be careful of with repellents is most of the things you hear about on the radio have these interesting food concoctions that I can tell you based on research I've been part of. Food will fail eventually. Deer will get used to the weirdest food. Deer will get used to pepper. They will get used to lots of different food concoctions. However, fear-based repellents, such as something that's 100% blood meal, like this plant skid you're seeing here, deer need to become cannibals or carnivores to get used to the blood. So blood has been shown to be very effective consistently. And if you go to Plant Skid's website, they actually have some trials where they show that the blood meal has worked for years and years and years. I've been using it since like 2007, and I've had very good luck with it. Next slide. So when you're planting, and we just have a couple slides left, and I know I'm pushing over what I meant to a little bit, but we had some technology difficulties in the beginning, and I apologize for that. Again, we're new at this. So when you're ready to plant and you're on site, a couple things to keep in mind. Keep those roots moist always. Never let those roots dry out ever. So when you have bundles of them in your packing paper and you're out on site putting them in the ground, keep those bundles closed and keep, a little bit of water on those roots. Just drizzle a little bit of water on them as need be to keep them moist, keep them in a shady spot, and only unbundle them when you're pulling out some seedlings to plant. Or if you're going to put them in your planting bag, make sure they're nice and covered and just not exposed and drying out as you're walking around with them. You can do something called root pruning. We try to do this at the district before we pass it off to landowners. But a lot of times when you get these seedlings from the nursery, they're going to have these super long, gangly roots. And The problem with that is if you just jam those trees in the ground, unless you dig a gigantic hole to accommodate those big, long, gangly roots, the roots are going to constrict themselves and they'll die just from the root constriction. So with these -1 seedlings and the -0 seedlings, typically you can prune those roots back to 8 to 10 inches of length. When you're in -1s and -2s, you have to be a little bit more careful. You're really there. You just need to trim a little bit of those roots off and then make a big hole. But with the -0 seedlings, 8 to 10 inches of root length is pretty adequate. I would never go less than 8, but you can prune those roots back to that length, and that's typically how you get them from us at a district tree sale. Planting gel, this one is controversial. Um, the research definitely shows that planting gel such as Terrasorb will create a higher moisture environment around those roots. What I have not found in the research is that this actually equates to higher survival rates. So in my opinion, we need more information on this. And I also am sometimes concerned about putting some sort of product on roots that, need to find mycorrhizal fungi associations in the soil. When you put them in the ground, they need those mycorrhizal fungi to grab their nutrients. That relationship is necessary for most plants, in fact. So I don't have a strong opinion on this. Some people have told me that they had really great luck with planting gel, and they're convinced that it really made a difference, and that could very well be true. I just haven't found anything that really has shown that this planting gel equates to higher survival. And if anybody has information on that, I would really love to see that, because it would be good to know a little more on this. All I've seen is that it equates to higher root moisture near those roots. Next slide. Correct planting depth, very important. You don't want the root collar, which is this little area that can kind of show up as a tiny swelling on a small seedling, or there'll be like little rings almost. If we were in person, I could show you. You don't ever want that more than a ½ inch below ground level. When you get bigger stock, it's actually easier to figure out if you're at the proper planting depth, because the little flare at the base of the trunk, that needs to be at ground level, not below ground level. Fruit trees are different, which maybe Emily will touch on this, because that root graft needs to be in a different place altogether. But with non-grafted trees, planting too deep is probably one of the most common reasons trees die when people put them in the ground, because they put them way too deep. And as those trees get bigger, if the diameter of that trunk is equal at ground level as it is farther up the tree, the tree was too deep. When you look at trees in the wild, next time you're in the forest, look at them. You will always see a slight flare at the base at ground level. That is the proper depth for a tree. And that's where you want them to be when they're small as well, and you put them in the ground. Because too deep of a planting sometimes won't result in death for even 10 years later. And of course, you don't want to do something called J-rooting the seedling. That's that bottom picture you see. You don't want to smash those roots into the hole. Those roots should be growing outward and downward, the same as if a seed dropped to the ground and started growing its roots outward and downward. That's how you want them to look. So don't force your seedling into the hole. If you have to dig a bigger hole, that's what you have to do. Next slide. And then lots of opinions on this. If you think there's a 2 to 3 week period that's going to be rain free, that is considered a drought for a small seedling. There are lots of recommendations on how you should water. I can tell you should water right away when you put the trees in the ground. And then what you do after that, there's just lots of different opinions on this. So some folks will say water right away, and then the very next day, then 3 days later, then 3 days after that. And then if you have a drought, make sure you're watering every 7 to 10 days. One thing I do not advocate is soaking the seedling every single day, because this actually trains the roots to grow the wrong way, and it can cause other problems like root rot and things like that. So you want to give the seedlings a good drink, but make sure you just do it periodically. So I like the water right away, water the next day, and then 3 days later, then 3 days later, and then maybe once a week after that. I think that's a good system. A little less if you have clay soils, because clay will hold on to that water. But you just kind of want to gauge that based on the size of your tree and what kind of rain you're getting from Mother Nature in your area. And that's a good topic to talk to a professional about. I'm always available to talk with folks about that. But you won't get the same answer from multiple resources on how much to water and how often. Fertilizing is another one. I can tell you quick release fertilizers can actually be quite harmful to young seedlings. It creates the same type of effect that road salt can. So when you put too much of these quick release fertilizers on a tree seedling, it actually causes this thing underground called reverse osmosis, which draws water out of the roots instead of the seedlings taking water from the soil into the roots. So it's sort of a salting effect. There is some promise with certain types of slow release fertilizers, but I would say still be careful with how much of that you're putting down, because if you're matching your species to the site, then a lot of times fertilization should not be necessary. Next slide. All right, so just there's some references. Emily, you can just kind of go through these next couple of slides. I just want to make sure that the references are acknowledged so that they show up in the video. And then there's my contact info. Again, when you guys go back to the video, you can see this. You can pause the video, thankfully. And that is all I have.
We can probably address a couple of the questions in the chat here while we have Josh.
Yeah.
So Josh, just to catch up on one of the recent questions, you were talking about fertilizer. So any, I guess, type, it says the question is best type of fertilizer to use on planting. You want to add more detail?
Yeah, I actually don't use it at all on these young tree seedlings. And keep in mind, this does not apply to larger like landscape stock, and it would also not apply to these larger fruit trees. So, you know, Emily may have some thoughts on fertilizing fruit trees. At the Mason Lake District, we have these pellets, which are slow release. For any trees that are very small up to even these landscape size stuff, and by that I mean like 5, 6, 7 feet tall, I still only recommend slow release. I think that's the way to go. It breaks down at a speed where the trees can take it up. You're not losing nitrogen to the groundwater, and you're also not causing that salting effect on your seedlings. But I can call Cama Ross out if she's on this, and maybe she has something to say about biochar. Cama, are you on here?
I thought I saw her earlier. Let me see if I can get her unmuted and then put her on the spot.
Hi, yeah, I'm here.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yep, hi Cama.
Yeah, I do have a thought and a promotion for biochar. It is basically biochar is like charcoal, but it used in conjunction with well-decomposed compost. What it does is it gives those microbes and all those beneficial microorganisms that we want in that root zone a place to hide. And it also does help with retaining moisture in that root zone area during those first couple of years of seedling establishment. So we are doing some research locally with biochar compost in planting situations like this. But research is showing with our sandy soils, it's really it's a winner. So I think we'll find similar results of our local trials here, but I'll let you know. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Cama. One quick comment before Emily gets going. I saw, I was only able to catch a few in the chat box. Danny's really been watching those, but Greg had a couple good comments on there, including one just about earthworms. And yeah, I agree, Greg. Earthworms are non-native and can be a problem in forests. But Greg made another good point, which is sometimes containerized seedlings can draw deer more than the bare root. And I have seen that planting containerized stock up in the UP, and the thought there's a lot of reasons there, but it could be that the TLC that goes into the amended soil in that containerized stock, deer actually have an interesting way of smelling nitrogen if seedlings have been fertilized quite recently. So sometimes putting a tree in the ground with amended soil can actually draw deer more than if you're just sticking bare root stock in. So thank you, Greg. That's a good point.